On a cold New York morning in 2025, the city bustled with early commuters, news vans setting up, and pedestrians hurrying past the gleaming facade of Trump Tower, unaware that history was about to unfold before them. It started as an ordinary day for most, but for one homeless woman huddled against the side of the building, it was just another morning of survival. Emily Martinez, a former combat medic and decorated veteran, adjusted her worn military jacket as she packed up her belongings, keeping a keen eye on her surroundings as she always did. The streets had rules, unspoken ones that only those who lived on them understood. She had chosen this spot not just for the warmth from the building's heating vents, but because of its visibility and security, ensuring she was not an easy target for those who preyed on the vulnerable. But today, there was something different in the air. The guards outside Trump Tower were unusually alert, news crews were positioning their cameras, and an unusual tension crackled through the crowd gathering nearby. Instinctively, Emily's combat training kicked in, scanning for threats, reading the shifts in body language of those around her. Then, without warning, the doors of Trump Tower swung open, and a man who commanded attention in every room he entered stepped forward. President Donald Trump, no longer in office but still one of the most recognizable figures in the world, broke from his security detail and walked with purpose toward the sidewalk. The moment was surreal. Cameras flashed wildly, reporters scrambled for their microphones, and the gathered onlookers gasped in disbelief. This was not on any scheduled agenda. Trump's security team moved swiftly to adjust their formation, their earpieces buzzing with concern. But he waved them off, his gaze fixed on something, or rather, someone. Emily felt her breath hitch as she realized he was walking directly toward her. Her instinct was to shrink into the background, as she always did, but this time, there was no escaping the spotlight. Trump reached into his coat pocket, his expression shifting from the familiar confidence he carried in front of cameras to something deeper, something almost unreadable. He pulled out a photograph, a slightly worn military image of a combat medic kneeling beside a wounded soldier in Afghanistan. Emily's heart pounded as recognition struck her like a thunderclap. She knew that moment. She had lived that moment. It was the day everything changed. The day she had pulled a gravely injured soldier from a burning Humvee, tending to his wounds under gunfire, keeping him alive by sheer force of will and the lullaby she had sung to him as he fought to stay conscious. But what was Trump doing with that photograph? And how did he know? The world around her faded as Trump finally spoke, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You saved his life," he said simply. The crowd fell silent, straining to hear. "My nephew, Mark. He's been looking for you ever since." Emily's mind reeled, the past and present colliding in a way she could barely comprehend. The soldier she had fought to save, the one she had wondered about for years, never knowing if he had survived, was alive, and he had been searching for her. The weight of everything she had endured, the PTSD, the nights on the street, the battles she had fought alone, seemed to shift in that moment, as though, for the first time in years, something in her life made sense. The cameras kept rolling, social media exploded with speculation, and the security team remained tense, but none of it mattered in that instant. This wasn't about politics, about optics, or about a staged encounter. This was about something far deeper, a debt that could never truly be repaid, a connection forged in war, and a moment that would change not just Emily's life, but the lives of countless veterans who had been forgotten by the system they once served. And as Trump extended his hand toward her, Emily made a choice. The choice to stop running from her past and finally face what came next. Emily Martinez had not always been invisible. There was a time when people looked up to her, when her name meant something, when she was respected for her skills, her courage, and her dedication. Once, she had been Staff Sergeant Emily Martinez, a highly decorated combat medic, known for her unwavering resolve under fire. She had spent years on the front lines, running through gunfire to save lives, making split-second decisions that determined whether a soldier would make it home or become another name on a memorial wall. She had been the one people turned to when everything was falling apart, the steady hand in the chaos of war. But war had a way of taking more than it gave. The medals she had earned for valor sat in a storage unit she could no longer afford, gathering dust along with the life she had lost. The woman she once was had been buried under the weight of trauma, loss, and a system that had failed to catch her before she fell. The street had not been her first stop after leaving the military. Like many veterans, she had tried to rebuild, to reintegrate into civilian life. She had gone back to school, finishing her medical training and opening a small trauma practice in Philadelphia. For a while, things seemed to be falling into place. She had a home, a career, a purpose. But PTSD did not care about her plans. It crept in slowly at first, just in the quiet moments, in the spaces between patient visits, in the nights when she couldn't sleep. Then, it became something she could no longer ignore. The flashbacks started coming in waves, triggered by sounds, smells, moments that transported her back to Afghanistan without warning. The sound of sirens would send her heart racing. The smell of burning rubber would take her back to that day when she had pulled Mark Trump from the wreckage of a Humvee while bullets whizzed past her head. She could still hear his voice, weak and trembling as he clung to her lullaby, fighting to stay awake. At first, she tried to push through it. Medication, therapy, work, anything to keep moving forward. But the wait lists for VA mental health services stretched for months, and the nightmares did not wait. The walls of her trauma practice began to close in on her. She started missing appointments, avoiding phone calls. Her hands, once so steady in the field, began to tremble. Patients noticed. Her colleagues noticed. Then, one day, she simply couldn't go back. The practice folded, and with it the last tether to the life she had built. Losing the practice meant losing her apartment. She couch-surfed with friends at first, making promises that she would get back on her feet soon, but time stretched and patience wore thin. Family members, once supportive, grew distant. "You're not the same anymore," her sister had said in their last conversation. "You need to try harder." But Emily had tried. She had filled out the forms, sat through the VA meetings, made the calls, waited in the shelters. The system that had sent her to war had no place for her now that she was home. The first night on the streets was the hardest. She had thought she would find a way back quickly, a temporary setback, she told herself. But days turned into weeks, then months. She learned the unspoken rules of survival, the safe places to sleep, the best shelters to find food, the businesses that would let you use the restroom without calling security. She carried her military ID, hoping it might make people see her differently, but most of the time it didn't matter. To the world, she was just another homeless person, someone to be ignored, pitied, or moved along. Even so, she refused to let go of all of herself. She kept a routine, as she had in the military: pack up her belongings before dawn, keep everything organized, never let her space become messy. Routine kept her grounded, gave her something to hold on to, and she still helped where she could. Other homeless veterans found her, recognizing the way she carried herself, the way she scanned her surroundings out of habit. She would share what little she had, direct them to resources, patch them up when needed. The medic in her had never disappeared, even when everything else had. Now, standing on a New York sidewalk in front of one of the most powerful men in the world, she felt the weight of all of it pressing down on her. The years of survival, of struggle, of feeling unseen, and yet here was Donald Trump, looking at her like she mattered, like she wasn't just another statistic, another casualty of a broken system. Here he was, holding a photograph of her in the field, in her element, in the moment when she had been exactly who she was meant to be. 1,000 emotions surged through her at once: disbelief, hope, fear. She had spent so long trying to disappear, to avoid attention, to live in the margins of a world that had no place for her anymore. And now, in the span of a few minutes, her past had come crashing back into her life. The soldier she had saved had never forgotten her life. The lullaby she had sung had stayed with him. The life she thought she had lost was still there, waiting for her to reclaim it. Emily's hands clenched into fists at her sides as she steadied herself. She had survived war. She had survived the streets. And now, she was standing at the edge of something she never expected: a second chance. For years, Emily Martinez had wondered what had happened to the soldier she had saved in Afghanistan. She had never known his name, never learned if he had survived beyond that chaotic battlefield where she had dragged him from a burning Humvee, her hands slick with his blood as she fought to keep him alive. The last thing she had seen of him before being pulled away to tend to another casualty was his face, barely conscious, his lips moving as if trying to hold onto the lullaby she had sung to keep him awake. Then he was gone, whisked away by the medevac team, and she was left to wonder. Now, standing on a cold sidewalk in front of Trump Tower, she was looking at a photograph of that very moment. Her kneeling beside him, pressing gauze against his wounds, the dust and fire of the battlefield surrounding them. And the man showing it to her was none other than Donald Trump. Emily's mind reeled as Trump spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You saved his life," he said, holding her gaze. "My nephew, Mark. He's been looking for you ever since." The words struck her like a physical blow, and for a moment she forgot about the crowd, the flashing cameras, the reporters whispering into their microphones. Mark. The soldier she had never forgotten, the one she had tried to find, though she never had enough information. He was alive. He had been searching for her, and now Donald Trump was standing in front of her, delivering the answer she had given up hope of ever finding. Her throat tightened as she tried to process it all. Mark Trump. She had saved a Trump. She had fought to keep the nephew of one of the most powerful men in America alive without ever knowing it, and somehow, through sheer fate or something greater, their paths had led back to this moment. It seemed impossible, but then again, so had that day in Afghanistan. The memory hit her with force. The convoy had been moving through the outskirts of Kandahar, a mission that was supposed to be routine: secure a supply route, escort personnel, avoid unnecessary engagement. Then the explosion. The Humvee had flipped, fire erupting from its engine, gunfire ripping through the air before anyone could react. Emily had moved before thinking, the weight of her medical pack familiar on her back as she sprinted toward the wreckage. Williams had shouted at her to wait for cover, but there was no waiting when a soldier was bleeding out. She had pulled Mark free, his body broken but still breathing, and then the real fight began. She had stabilized him as best she could under fire, ignoring her own wounds, focusing only on keeping him conscious, keeping him breathing. And when the pain had threatened to pull him under, she had sung. She had no idea if he remembered that part, but she did. The lullaby, her mother's voice in her head. The words instinctive. She had sung it softly as she worked, as she kept him awake, refusing to let him slip away. It was all she had been able to offer beyond her medical skills, a voice to hold on to when everything else was slipping away. And now he was here, alive, and looking for her. Trant studied her, his expression unreadable. "He never forgot you," he said, tucking the photograph back into his coat. "After he recovered, he kept trying to find you, but there wasn't much to go on, no name, just a memory of a medic who saved his life and a lullaby he never stopped hearing." Emily swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "He remembers that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Trump nodded. "More than you know." He took a breath, glancing at the crowd, the security team growing increasingly restless around them. But he wasn't finished. "Mark isn't just alive. He's been working for the last 3 years to help other veterans. Because of you." Emily felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. The past she had tried to leave behind, the years she had spent wondering, the soldier she had saved, whose life had taken a path she had never imagined. And now, standing on a street corner in New York, she was about to walk through the doors of Trump Tower and come face to face with the soldier she had never forgotten. Donald Trump had spent years surrounded by powerful people, politicians, businessmen, world leaders. He had shaken hands with kings, sat at tables where the fate of nations was discussed, and stood before crowds that stretched as far as the eye could see. But as he stood in front of Emily Martinez, a homeless veteran with tired eyes and a worn military jacket, he knew he was in the presence of someone whose strength could not be measured in wealth or influence. This woman had saved his nephew's life. She had risked everything, bled for her country, and been forgotten by the very system that had sent her to war. And now, here she was, standing in the cold outside Trump Tower, unnoticed by the world. Until today. Trump had never been one to ignore his instincts, and in that moment every instinct told him that this was a story that needed to be told. The cameras were rolling, the reporters were whispering, and security was urging him to step back inside, but he waved them off. This wasn't just another PR moment, this was personal. Emily's eyes were wary, trained from years of survival, but there was something else there too. A flicker of recognition. She didn't know why he was here, didn't yet understand the connection between them, but she could sense that something was different. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts too, and right now they were telling her that whatever was happening, it wasn't random. Trump reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the photograph, the one Mark had given him months ago. He held it up so she could see, and the moment her gaze landed on it, something in her face changed. Recognition, shock, emotion that she quickly tried to hide. "You saved his life," Trump said, his voice quieter now, meant only for her. "Mark, my nephew." The words hit like a physical blow. Emily had spent years wondering what had happened to that young soldier, whether he had lived or died, whether the lullaby she had sung had been the last thing he ever heard. And now, standing in front of her, was the most powerful man in the country telling her that not only had he survived, he had never stopped looking for her. Trump saw the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the way her jaw tightened as she processed the weight of what he was saying. She was a soldier, used to keeping her emotions locked away, but this moment was different. You know him?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Trump nodded. "More than that, he's been trying to find you for 3 years." The crowd around them was growing restless. Phones were raised, cameras flashing, the buzz of news reporters speculating what was happening. But Trump didn't care. He had always believed in acting on instinct, and right now, his instincts told him that Emily Martinez was someone the world needed to see. One of his security advisors leaned in. "Sir, we should move inside." Trump ignored him. Instead, he took a step closer to Emily, lowering his voice. "Come inside. Mark is waiting for you." Emily swallowed, her body tense. She had spent so long in the shadows, avoiding attention, surviving in the margins of a world that had no place for her. And now, in the span of a few minutes, everything had changed. She looked past Trump at the gleaming doors of Trump Tower, at the world she had once belonged to, before PTSD, before the nightmares, before the streets. Part of her wanted to run, to disappear like she always had, but another part of her, the soldier, the medic, the woman who had fought for others even when no one fought for her, told her to stay. Trump could see the hesitation in her face. He had dealt with hardened negotiators, military generals, and world leaders, but he recognized something different in Emily, someone who had given everything and expected nothing in return. He had seen that same look in his nephew's eyes when he first came home from Afghanistan, lost, guarded, waiting for the world to push him aside. He wasn't going to let that happen again. "I know you don't need charity," Trump said, reading her posture before she could say a word. "This isn't charity. This is about doing what's right. You saved Mark. It's time someone did something for you." Emily's hands trembled slightly, but she forced them still. She had never wanted recognition. She had never asked for anything in return. But standing here, looking at the most powerful man in the country telling her that she mattered, that her sacrifice had not been forgotten, it felt like something she had spent years waiting to hear. Trump gestured toward the entrance. "Come inside, Sergeant Martinez. Let's fix this." For a long moment she didn't move. The noise around them seemed distant, the world watching and waiting. Then, finally, she nodded. And as Donald Trump led Emily Martinez into Trump Tower, the world watched as a forgotten hero stepped out of the shadows and into the light. As the golden doors of Trump Tower closed behind them, the noise of the outside world seemed to fade. The reporters, the flashing cameras, the murmurs of the gathered crowd. It was all left behind on the New York sidewalk. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter, grand, yet strangely intimate. Emily Martinez tightened her grip on the straps of her backpack, the only thing she truly owned, as she stepped into the opulence of the marble-floored lobby. It was a stark contrast to the cold pavement she had called home for so long. Just hours ago, she had been another forgotten veteran trying to make it through another day. Now, she was standing beside Donald Trump, being led toward a meeting she never could have imagined. Trump walked with purpose, his security detail forming a protective circle around them. But Emily wasn't afraid. Years of combat had conditioned her to walk into unpredictable situations with her head high and her senses sharp. This was no battlefield, yet she felt that same awareness thrumming through her, her instincts telling her that whatever was about to happen next would change everything. As they entered the elevator, Trump turned to her, studying her face. He saw the tension in her jaw, the guarded look in her eyes. He had seen it before in Mark when he first came home, the look of someone who had survived more than most could ever understand. "I don't know what you've been through these past few years," Trump said, his voice steady but not unkind. "But I do know you don't belong out there on the streets." Emily looked at him, unsure of how to respond. It had been a long time since anyone had told her where she did or didn't belong. For years, she had been invisible. Now, the most powerful man in the country was telling her that she mattered. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a spacious executive suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. And standing by the window, looking out at the skyline, was Mark Trump. Emily's breath caught in her throat. He was older now, his uniform replaced with a tailored suit, but there was no mistaking the eyes. The same eyes she had locked onto as she fought to keep him alive in the dust and fire of Afghanistan. For years she had wondered if he had survived. Now she was looking at proof that he had. Mark turned, and when he saw her, something in his expression changed. Recognition, disbelief, relief all at once. "You're real," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't sure I'd ever find you." Emily forced a breath past the lump in her throat. "I wasn't sure either." For a moment, neither of them moved. The past, the years of searching, the battle that had connected them, it all hung in the air between them. Then Mark stepped forward and extended a hand. "You saved my life," he said simply. Emily looked at his hand, then at his face. "You were my patient," she corrected, but there was a warmth in her voice that hadn't been there before. Trump stepped back, letting them have their moment. Then, after a brief pause, he spoke. "Mark's been working on something these past few years, something that could help thousands of veterans, and we want you to be a part of it." Emily's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Mark stepped beside his uncle, pulling out a sleek folder and placing it on the table in front of her. "I started a foundation, Angel Watch. It's focused on getting veterans immediate mental health care, no waiting lists, no bureaucracy. We've been building partnerships with hospitals across the country to get vets the help they need, fast. No more falling through the cracks." Emily stared at the folder, then back at Mark. "And you want me to—" Trump folded his arms. "We want you to help us run it." Emily blinked, feeling as though the ground had just shifted beneath her. "I don't— Why me?" Mark's expression softened. "Because you understand what it means to be out there. You've lived it. And because none of this would exist if it weren't for you. You saved me, Sergeant Martinez. Now I want you to help save others." Emily's heart pounded. This was more than just an offer. It was a way back, a chance to rebuild, not just her own life, but the lives of others like her. It was everything she had lost, being handed back to her in a way she never expected. Trump stepped forward, his voice firm but kind. "This is your second chance, Emily. Take it." For the first time in years, Emily let herself consider something she had long since given up on. Hope. Emily Martinez had spent years wondering what had happened to the young soldier she had saved in Afghanistan. In the moments after she had dragged him from the burning Humvee, stabilizing him with every bit of strength and training she had left, she had whispered to him to hold on. She had sung the Spanish lullaby her mother had taught her, keeping him conscious, keeping him fighting. But then the medevac arrived and she had been ordered to move on to the next wounded soldier. That was the last time she saw him. She had never learned his name. She had never known if he had survived. She had tried to look through casualty reports, but there were too many names, too many tragedies. Eventually she had accepted that she would never know, And now, standing in a room high above New York City, she was looking into the eyes of the man she had once fought so desperately to keep alive, Mark Trump. The name was foreign to her, but the face, the voice, those were unmistakable. His suit and clean-shaven face were a stark contrast to the bloodied soldier she remembered, but his eyes held the same intensity, the same gratitude she had seen as she worked to keep him breathing in the middle of that war zone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Mark was the first to break the silence. "You're real." Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "Yeah," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "I'm real." Mark took a step forward, as if making sure she wouldn't disappear. "I looked for you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "For years I looked for you. I didn't know your name, the records were a mess, but I never forgot. I couldn't." Emily's throat tightened. "I wasn't sure you made it," she admitted. "By the time I got back to base, everything was chaos. I checked casualty reports, but—" She trailed off, shaking her head. Mark exhaled, nodding slowly. "I made it. Because of you." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I remember everything. The gunfire, the heat, the pain. And I remember your voice. That song, it was the only thing keeping me awake." Emily felt something stir inside her that she hadn't felt in years. Recognition. Purpose. "It was my mother's lullaby," she said softly. Mark swallowed hard, looking down for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "It saved me." The room was silent except for the distant hum of the city below. Donald Trump stood nearby, watching the exchange with an expression unreadable to most, but filled with understanding. He had seen this moment coming, but even he hadn't expected it to feel this monumental. Mark took another step forward, hesitation in his movements. "I don't know how to say thank you in a way that's big enough." Emily shook her head. "You don't have to." But Mark wasn't finished. "No, I do, because it's not just me. What you did, what you've done, it should have never ended with you sleeping on a street corner." His jaw tightened. "That's why I started Angel Watch. And that's why we need you." Emily exhaled, trying to process the weight of what he was saying. "Mark, I don't—" He raised a hand, stopping her. "Just listen. After I got home, I struggled. The nightmares, the guilt, the anger. I know you know what I'm talking about, and I had every advantage. I had a family that supported me, resources to get help, but even then it was hard. And when I started looking into it, I realized just how many veterans never even get a fraction of that help. People like you." Emily felt the truth of his words settle deep in her chest. She had lived it. She had spent nights in shelters full of other veterans, men and women who had given everything only to be forgotten by the system that once called them heroes. Mark's voice softened. "You saved me, Emily, and now I want to do for others what you did for me. But I can't do it without you." Emily glanced at Donald Trump, who had remained silent, letting the moment play out. His expression was unreadable, but when he spoke, his words were steady. "This isn't just about a job, Sergeant Martinez. This is about changing lives, yours included." Emily's fingers curled around the straps of her backpack. She had spent so long surviving, just trying to make it through each day. The idea that there could be more, that there could be a way forward, a way to make her past mean something, was almost too much to believe. Mark took another step forward, now close enough that she could see the faint scars near his temple, remnants of the explosion that had almost taken him. "I don't know if I would have made it without you," he admitted. "And I don't know how many more veterans won't make it unless we do something about it." Emily swallowed hard, feeling emotions she had buried for years clawing their way back up. She had told herself that what she had done in Afghanistan was just her job, that she wasn't special, that she was just another medic doing what she had been trained to do. But standing here, in front of the man she had saved, hearing the way he spoke about what she had done, it made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was meant for something more than just surviving. Donald Trump cleared his throat. "I know it's a lot to take in," he said, "but the way I see it, you have two choices. You can walk back out those doors and disappear again, or you can walk forward and take what's being offered." A second chance, not just for you, but for a lot of other people who need it. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. She had spent so long thinking that her story had ended on a battlefield, that she had given all she had to give. But now, she wasn't so sure. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. He stepped forward, pressing it into her hand. When Emily looked down, she saw a military challenge coin, one that bore the insignia of their old unit. "Come with us," Mark said. "Help us make a difference." Emily stared at the coin in her hand, then at Mark, then at Trump, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her fight wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning. The moment Donald Trump broke away from his security detail and approached Emily Martinez on that cold New York morning, the cameras were already rolling, and within minutes the world had its next viral sensation. The story exploded across social media before Emily even stepped inside Trump Tower. News outlets scrambled to analyze the footage while Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok ignited with speculation, debates, and opinions from every political corner. Some called it a heartwarming story of a veteran finally getting the recognition she deserved, while others immediately labeled it a political stunt orchestrated by Trump's team. But as the story gained momentum, one thing became clear: this was bigger than politics. This was a story about sacrifice, resilience, and the reality of what happens to many veterans after they return home. Within hours, images of Emily in her worn military jacket standing face to face with Trump were plastered across every major news network. Conservative outlets hailed it as proof of Trump's unwavering support for veterans, a moment of genuine human connection that showed his commitment to those who had served. Liberal commentators, on the other hand, were quick to question the timing, some even speculating whether Emily had been planted there for dramatic effect. But as more details emerged, her name, her service record, her past as a decorated combat medic who had once saved lives in Afghanistan, the skepticism began to wane. A single photograph went viral, a side-by-side image of Emily in her military uniform, standing tall with her unit before deployment, and another of her on the street corner outside Trump Tower, clutching a backpack with everything she owned. The contrast was jarring. The image alone sparked outrage, not at Trump, but at the system that had allowed this to happen. Commentators across the political spectrum began asking the same question: how does a woman who risked her life for her country end up homeless and forgotten? How many more Emilys were out there, sleeping in doorways, ignored by the very nation they fought for? The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Veteran organizations flooded social media with calls to action, demanding better support for former service members struggling with PTSD, unemployment, and homelessness. Hashtags like "Help Our Vets" and "No Vet Left Behind" started trending. Donations to veteran housing programs spiked overnight. Even celebrities and high-profile figures joined the conversation, offering support, sharing their own experiences, and calling for policy changes. What had started as a single encounter on a New York street corner had become a national conversation about the treatment of American veterans. But the impact went beyond just discussion. The exposure led to a flood of resources directed toward helping Emily personally. Strangers began calling local shelters, asking how they could help. Offers of employment, housing, and medical assistance poured in. Several high-profile figures publicly pledged financial support to ensure she was taken care of. And then, as more people dug into her background, the media uncovered something even more powerful: her connection to Mark Trump, the young soldier she had saved in Afghanistan. Once that detail surfaced, the story took on an entirely new dimension. Mark Trump had been searching for the medic who saved his life for years, and now, by pure chance, they had been reunited under the most unlikely circumstances. The revelation sent the internet into a frenzy. News anchors spoke in astonishment about the odds of such an encounter. Late-night talk shows covered it with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Even those who had originally dismissed the event as a publicity stunt now admitted that no one could have scripted something this extraordinary. Then, Trump's team made an announcement that added another layer to the growing movement. Emily Martinez had accepted an offer to join Angel Watch, the foundation founded by Mark Trump to support struggling veterans. This wasn't just a temporary media moment, it was the beginning of something bigger. Emily wasn't just receiving help, she was becoming part of a mission to help others like her. Critics, who had initially dismissed the encounter as a political spectacle, were left scrambling for new angles. Some continued to question whether Trump was capitalizing on the moment, but the momentum was now out of their control. The narrative had shifted. This was no longer just about Trump. This was about America's veterans, about how easily they could be forgotten, and about the urgent need to change that. As Emily sat inside Trump Tower, processing the whirlwind of events, she couldn't have anticipated how much her life had changed in a matter of hours. She had spent years believing she was invisible, that her sacrifices had been forgotten, and now the world was watching, listening, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving. She was stepping into a role that could finally make a difference, not just for herself, but for countless others like her. Emily Martinez had spent years believing that her story was over, that her service had ended the day she left Afghanistan, only to face a different kind of battle back home. But as she sat inside Trump Tower, staring at the screen filled with news reports about her story, she realized something profound. Her mission wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The world now knew her name, knew her struggles, and most importantly, knew the truth about what happened to far too many veterans like her. But awareness wasn't enough. Change required action, and for the first time in years, Emily felt like she had the power to do something about it. The past few days had been overwhelming, the attention nearly suffocating. She had gone from being invisible on a street corner to being a national symbol of resilience, proof of both the failures and the potential of America's veteran support system. But what did it all mean if nothing changed? Mark Trump had made his offer clear. He wanted her to join Angel Watch, to become a leading voice for veterans who had been left behind by the system. But Emily wasn't sure if she was ready. She had spent so long trying to keep herself afloat, fighting just to make it through each day. The idea of stepping into a role where she was responsible for helping others was daunting. What if she wasn't strong enough? What if she failed? Those doubts had haunted her for years, but as she looked across the room at Mark, at the young soldier she had once saved who now stood strong and determined, she realized something. She had already been doing the work without realizing it. On the streets, she had looked out for others, shared what little she had, guided fellow veterans to shelters, and connected them with resources when she could. She had never stopped being a medic. She had just been operating in a different battlefield. Trump's voice cut through her thoughts, steady and direct. "You've already proven you're a leader, Emily. You didn't just save Mark's life that day in Afghanistan. You saved 3 more soldiers after him, even when you were injured yourself. That's who you are, and it's time the world sees that." She let his words sink in, the memories flooding back, the weight of her medic bag, the dust and heat of the desert, the smell of blood and burning metal. She had made split-second decisions that had determined whether men lived or died, and yet, somehow, she had convinced herself that she was incapable of making an impact now. But that was a lie she had told herself for too long. Mark leaned forward, determination burning in his eyes. "I spent 3 years looking for you, not just to thank you, but because I knew you weren't done. You may not have seen it yet, but I have. You're not just meant to be a part of this, you're meant to lead it." The weight of his words settled on her, not as a burden, but as a call to action. She had spent so long thinking about what she had lost, her career, her home, her sense of purpose, that she had forgotten what she still had, her experience, her skills, her ability to connect with people who were struggling the same way she had. She wasn't just another homeless vet. She was proof that recovery was possible, that service didn't end when the uniform came off. She looked at the screen again, at the thousands of messages flooding in from veterans and their families. Some were words of encouragement, others were heartbreaking stories of their own struggles, but all carried the same message. They needed help, and now she had the opportunity to be the person who provided it. Emily took a deep breath, her hands steady for the first time in a long time. "All right," she said finally, her voice firm with newfound resolve. "Man, but I don't want to just be a spokesperson. I want to be on the ground, making real changes, fixing the system from the inside." Trump nodded, a satisfied smile on his face. "That's exactly what we need." Mark grinned, relief and pride evident in his expression. "Welcome to the fight, Doc." Emily Martinez had spent years thinking she was alone, that her battles were hers to fight in silence. But now she realized she had an army behind her, an army of veterans, supporters, and allies who were ready to stand with her. And as she looked out over the city, she understood that her story wasn't about survival anymore. It was about purpose, about unfinished business, about finally stepping into the role she was meant to play. The past had shaped her, but it wouldn't define her. The real battle was just beginning. Emily Martinez had spent years believing that her struggles were hers alone, that the weight of her experiences in Afghanistan and the battles she fought after coming home were something only she could carry. But as she sat inside Trump Tower, listening to Mark Trump lay out the mission of Angel Watch, she realized that this was bigger than her. This wasn't just about one veteran finding her way back. It was about the thousands of men and women just like her. Warriors who had served, sacrificed, and then been cast aside by a system that wasn't built to catch them when they fell. For too long, the nation had turned a blind eye to what happened after the parades ended, after the medals were pinned, after the uniforms were folded and placed in closets. Now, Emily had a chance to be part of something that could change that. Mark pulled up the statistics, the hard numbers that told a story no one wanted to acknowledge. Over 3,700 veterans were homeless on any given night in America. Nearly 20 veterans a day took their own lives, struggling with PTSD, depression, and a lack of access to proper care. Thousands more cycled in and out of shelters, jails, and hospitals, caught in a system that didn't know how to help them heal. "We keep saying we support our troops," Mark said, his voice heavy with frustration. "But what happens when those troops come home and need support themselves? We've spent billions on defense, on war, but where's that same investment in the people who fought those wars?" Emily had lived those statistics. She had been one of those numbers. She had stood in shelter lines, filled out the endless paperwork at the VA, waited for phone calls that never came, and struggled to keep going when the world seemed to have forgotten her. And now, sitting in this room, she realized something. She had survived for a reason. She had made it through Afghanistan, through the nightmares, through the streets, because her story wasn't meant to end there. She had a mission, and it was one bigger than herself. Trump leaned back in his chair, watching her with the knowing gaze of a man who had seen how power could be used to shape the world. "Emily, you have something that politicians and bureaucrats don't. You have their trust. These veterans, when they hear from you, they'll listen, because you've lived it. You're not some government official sitting in an office. You've been in the trenches. They need someone who understands, someone who actually cares enough to fight for them." His words rang true. How many times had she tried to explain her struggles to people who only nodded sympathetically, but never truly understood? How many times had she heard empty promises about fixing the system from leaders who had never spent a single night on the streets or sat in a waiting room for hours, only to be told to come back another day? Mark pointed to the screen again, this time showing a network of medical professionals, housing advocates, and mental health specialists who had already partnered with Angel Watch. "We're not just talking about change. We're making it happen. Fast-tracking medical care, getting vets housed first and dealing with the paperwork later, providing immediate mental health intervention instead of putting them on 6-month wait lists. And now that your story is out there, people are paying attention. We have donors calling in, hospitals offering to help. We have an opportunity to do something real, something that lasts." Emily felt the weight of it all settle over her, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. This wasn't just about fixing her own life. It was about standing up for every veteran who had ever been told to wait, to hold on just a little longer, to keep fighting a system that was supposed to be fighting for them. "I don't want this to just be about me," she said finally, her voice firm. "If we do this, we do it for everyone who's still out there, still struggling, still waiting for someone to care enough to change things." Trump nodded. "Then let's make it happen." The next steps were already in motion. Within hours, a press conference was scheduled not just to talk about Emily's story, but to announce a nationwide expansion of Angel Watch. Funding was pouring in from unexpected places. Business leaders, philanthropists, even former critics who saw the undeniable truth in the story. And for the first time in years, Emily felt something she had thought was lost forever: hope. This wasn't about politics, about party lines, about media narratives. This was about doing what was right. A mission bigger than one person, bigger than one story. A mission to ensure that no veteran ever had to walk the road she had walked alone. As she looked at Mark, at Trump, at the growing network of people ready to fight for this cause, she knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. The power of second chances was something Emily Martinez had never truly believed in, until now. For years, she had been convinced that once you fell, once you lost everything, there was no coming back. That was what the world had shown her. That was what her experience had drilled into her. She had watched as the system failed her, as doors closed in her face, as people who once respected her as a decorated combat medic now looked past her on the streets, unwilling or unable to acknowledge what had become of her life. But now, as she stood in front of a national audience, speaking at a press conference that was being streamed to millions, she realized something profound. A second chance wasn't just about getting another opportunity, it was about what you did with it. Her journey, from Afghanistan to homelessness to standing in Trump Tower as the face of a new movement, was proof that no one was beyond redemption. Not the veterans who had been left behind, not the country that had failed them, not even herself. She had been given a second chance, not just because someone powerful had recognized her, but because she had chosen to accept it. That was the hardest part, she realized. Not just waiting for an opportunity, but being willing to step forward and take it when it came. How many others had given up before their moment arrived? How many veterans had been so consumed by hopelessness that they never got the chance to turn things around? As she spoke to the press, Emily didn't focus on her own story alone. She spoke about every soldier who had returned home and felt lost, about every veteran who had been told to wait, to be patient, to navigate a system that was too slow and too broken to catch them before they fell. "We talk about honoring our heroes," she said, looking straight into the cameras, "but honoring them doesn't end when they take off the uniform. It's what we do after that matters. It's making sure no one who served this country ever has to sleep on the streets, ever has to wonder if help will come too late." The room was silent. Reporters who had come expecting another political spectacle instead finding themselves captivated by something much deeper. Donald Trump stood beside her, silent but resolute, letting her have this moment. It wasn't about him, and he knew it. It was about what came next. The expansion of Angel Watch was already underway, with medical providers, shelters, and donors stepping up to be part of a movement that had started with a single moment. A moment when one man had broken protocol, walked across a New York street, and chosen to see the person so many had ignored. That single decision had not just changed Emily's life, but had set in motion something far greater. Mark Trump, the soldier she had saved, stood nearby, watching her with the quiet respect of someone who knew firsthand the power of second chances. If she hadn't been there that day in Afghanistan, if she hadn't fought to keep him alive in the back of that burning Humvee, none of this would be happening. But it wasn't just about repaying a debt. It was about making sure that no other medic, no other soldier, no other veteran ever had to go through what she had. The press conference ended, but the work was only beginning. Calls flooded in from veterans across the country, from families who had lost loved ones, from active duty service members who now saw that there was hope waiting for them when they came home. And as Emily stepped away from the podium, she felt something she hadn't in years. Purpose. Second chances weren't given. They were taken. They were built, and now she was ready to make sure that every veteran out there got the chance they deserved. Because no one who had fought for their country should ever have to fight alone when they returned. This was more than just a moment. It was a movement. And Emily Martinez was ready to lead it. Life often presents us with unexpected challenges, and for many the hardest battles come long after the ones fought on the front lines. Emily Martinez's journey reminds us that struggle is not a sign of weakness, but a testament to resilience. Too often, society moves too fast to recognize those who have fallen through the cracks: veterans, the elderly, the homeless, or anyone who has faced hardship. But her story is proof that no one is beyond redemption. And sometimes all it takes is for someone to stop, look, and truly see the person behind the struggle. For older generations, this message carries even greater weight. Many have lived long enough to witness their own moments of loss, change, and the feeling of being left behind in a world that constantly moves forward. But Emily's story teaches us that second chances are not just for the young. They exist for anyone willing to embrace them, regardless of age or circumstance. Whether it is reconnecting with family, finding new purpose after retirement, or simply recognizing the value of shared wisdom, there is always an opportunity to make an impact. Her story also reminds us of the importance of gratitude and action. If we are in a position to help, we should. A simple act of kindness, a listening ear, or a helping hand can change someone's life in ways we may never fully realize. And if we are the ones in need, we must remember that asking for help is not a sign of failure, but of courage. At any stage in life, the ability to rise again, to find purpose, and to create meaningful change is what defines true strength. After all, life's greatest lessons often come from the moments when we choose to keep going.